You don't really mean to eat me, do you, ma'am?
Oh, indeed I do!
This is one of the scariest things to happen to me as a kid, and it's always stuck with me. It was about 10 years ago when I was 9 years old. I had just moved back to California with my family. We were to be living with my grandmother in a cramped 2-bed, 2-bathroom place, and I was excited. My grandma was an older, pretty religious Filipino woman, a converted Hindu and faithful Catholic. I'm not sure if that's a contradiction, because I don't know much about either religion, but her house had lots of shrines, candles, paintings of Jesus and Hindu gods, and this overall weird energy that I could palpably feel as a kid. It's important to note that I now consider myself a very open person, someone who may unknowingly attract these sorts of occurrences. This may not be important to the story, or maybe it is, I'm not entirely sure. But as a child, I would hear music and voices whispering to me, as well as smell strange things when triggered by certain words. At the time of this event, this was something I was used to and knew about myself. Because of this, I had some interest in Wicca and the occult. Not as much as I would later have, because I was still a child, but enough to often sit on the floor of my aunt's dimly lit and cramped room and look at her books on witchcraft. I don't know why and when, but around that time, I began to have super strange, frequent, and all-encompassing thoughts of the devil and demons. Like it would always be running through my mind, and I would comfort myself by remembering to recite some of the Hail Mary my mother had taught me. My aunt's room had a really creepy, suffocating feel to it, but I'd always spend time up there even though I felt as if there was someone watching me. I could place the energy, coming from in front of her closet. My aunt is mentally ill, and at the time was not on meds, so her room was filled with stuff, but especially the closet. It was always open a couple of feet or so, with lots of her things kind of stuffed in and falling out, and it was always pitch black on that side of the room, especially in the closet from what I could see. I slept up there with her, and was so jumpy and afraid all the time that I couldn't even shower by myself. One night, my aunt went out and my mother, my little brother, and I went to sleep on her bed. I remember I was so afraid, and I couldn't stop staring at this creepy green fairy thing that my aunt had hung from a string near her bed. It always seemed to sway, and I felt that when I looked in its eyes, it was sentient or something. I was in between my mom and brother, but sleeping the opposite way from them, at their feet, staring at the space near the closet. I fell asleep, and in my dream, I woke up. I sat straight up and felt such dread and fear. I'll never forget it. In the dream, I tapped my mom awake, and she looked at me in surprise and said, "Ayana, you're bleeding." I then felt my nose and realized blood was dripping from it. Then my eyes, my ears, and my mouth. I got super freaked out and said, "Mommy, I've been thinking about the devil a lot," and something along the lines of how I couldn't stop and was really scared. But by the time I was done talking, she actually laid back down and went back to sleep. Then, in a moment of fucking horror, something was on top of me. It was dark and I couldn't see, but I remember thinking it was a little white man. He was sitting on my chest with his knees on my collarbones, growling, hissing, making terrifying noises while literally, and I mean literally, was choking the absolute hell out of me. I was trying to flail my arms around, but I couldn't move. It lasted so long, I remember thinking, "Oh my God, when will this end?" And then, as suddenly as that, I woke up for real. I was laying on my back, breathing heavily and feeling sore, in the exact same spot as the dream. Briefly, I thought, "Oh no, is this real? Is it going to happen again?" So I lay down in silence until I could muster the courage to turn and look at the closet. I felt absolutely horrified. The space was radiating the most intense, deep hate and evil. I'll never forget, it stuck with me for so long. I could just feel something staring at me intensely, and also I had the sense that it knew that I knew it was there, that we were looking at each other in that moment. I rubbed my mom's hip for comfort and laid back down, immediately starting on a Hail Mary. I said it over and over until I could fall back asleep. For some reason, I also felt, although I was sleeping, that whatever it was left. I could just sense it walking out of the room. When I woke up, I went to stand near the closet, and the space now felt kind of empty. Anyway, I grew up and forgot about this story. I used to tell it to friends for a scary laugh. But I've just finished my first year of college and moved back here for the summer, so it's been on my mind. This wasn't even the most frightening thing to happen in this house, so we'll see if any other future things happen. Hopefully not. When I was a kid growing up in the late 90s, one of my best friends lived in a rural part of town. We met because he went to the same school, but he lived miles away from my more suburban neighborhood. We're still friends to this day, and we still talk about what happened on this night. We decided to have a camp out in the woods behind his house. His family didn't have a ton of land, but they had a pretty decent patch. And honestly, I have no idea who owned the land behind him. But for whatever reason, there was this old greenhouse about a quarter of a mile behind where his property ended, and it became the woods. It was just this old wooden building with windows and a fireplace. And I guess maybe somebody probably did live there at some point in time, but no one used it anymore, and we kind of turned it into our own little fort. We were 15 at the time and decided to spend the night out in our fort and have a fire and just do what kids do. We snuck a couple of 2 liters of wine coolers from his parents' fridge and thought we were being total badasses. Lol. It was a Saturday night in July when we did this. We went out to the fort in all seasons, but we never thought about staying out there until the summer. His parents and my parents were cool with it, so we made our way back there after we had dinner with his family. I brought my ghetto blaster, and we were just going to play music and hang out. We got a campfire going, and all was well with the music of the day playing on my ghetto. Probably some rap stuff that we were into back then. We were laughing and talking about a job that we wanted to get when we were 16, but we were also talking about the 2 girls we were dating at the time. This is going to sound cheesy, but there was a game that we played called MASH. You wrote the letters M-A-S-H on the top of a piece of paper, and then you had 5 different lines on one side of the paper, 5 different lines on the other side of the paper, and then 5 lines at the bottom. The first set on the left were supposed to be filled with the names of girls you thought were hot. The other set of lines on the right side were supposed to be jobs you would like to have in your future. And then finally, the 5 spaces at the bottom of the page were supposed to be just random numbers that would equal how many kids you would have. At the top of the page, the M stood for mansion, the A stood for apartment, the S stood for shack, and the H stood for house. You had to pick a random number, and the person you were playing with would use that number to go through all of the lines in the letters and cross them out systematically. Gosh, I hope this is making sense. Anyway, at the end of the game, you would end up with one of the letters, one of the girls you thought was the hottest, the job you really wanted, and the number of kids you would have. Part of the fun was we always made sure that some of the answers had to be outlandish. For example, 67,000 kids, or some crazy woman that you would never have any business being with. My friend, whom I'll call Eric for this story, started off the game and picked a bunch of funny things, and we were laughing before we even got the silly game going. He ended up with Sharon Stone as his wife, and they would live in a shack with 7 kids, and he would be a school teacher. We were dying of laughter. Right about that time, though, we heard a noise from the woods behind the fort. As I said, his place was very rural, and outside of the quarter to a half mile into the woods where this place was from his house, it was another 6 or 7 miles to the next road where people lived. It was rare for anybody to see anyone out there, save for a pond where some people once in a while would go fishing. The fishing there sucked. I don't think it was stocked, so like I said, it was rare. What we heard, though, was the sound of footsteps walking through the forest, the cracking of branches and the crushing of leaves. At first we thought, maybe it's his older brother coming out to scare us, or maybe even just wanting to hang out. But when we called out and said, "Hey, who's there?" no one answered, and the footsteps stopped. I said, "Hey, I think this is weird," and Eric said, "Hey, just chill out," and he gave me another plastic cup full of Bartles and James wine cooler. Yeah, okay, wine coolers, don't make fun of us. We sat listening for a while, and everything was still quiet, so we turned the music back on, and then decided to play another game of MASH. For whatever reason, I also decided to have Sharon Stone as one of the girls on my list. After the random number elimination, she ended up also being my wife. We were dying of laughter again. When I look back, I remember that Sharon Stone was like one of the hottest women in entertainment, so it was kind of obvious that we would pick her and put her onto the list. When the fire started to die down, we decided to go inside the fort and go to sleep. A while before this, we had dragged an industrial carpet out to the fort, so we just threw our sleeping bags on top of that and were going to talk ourselves to sleep listening to music. About an hour after we went into the fort, we started to hear the footsteps outside again, and no doubt about it, they were coming towards the fort. I whispered to Eric, "Hey, there really is somebody out there." And he responded, "Yeah, man, I know." We talked about making a run for it, but we didn't know who it was, or maybe it was just a deer, and maybe we were just being little girls. But after a few minutes, we heard the sounds of those footsteps right outside the fort, and suddenly, the entire building started to shake as if there was an army of guys outside. Whoever it was just shaking the hell out of it. Then we heard this crazy laughter, and I won't lie, I scooched over closer to Eric in my sleeping bag because I was scared. He was too. You know, even when you're 15 and you think you have the world by the ass, when something really scary happens, you don't always act like a tough guy. The shaking finally stopped after like 5 minutes, and we yelled out, "Hey, leave us alone. Get out of here. We'll just go if you want us to leave." We heard the footsteps slowly retreat back into the woods, and we just laid there for another hour or so, scared stiff and not knowing what to do. Finally, I crawled out of my sleeping bag and went to the fort door, pushed it open, and saw that the fire was starting to kick up a little bit again, but it was mostly just embers. We were leaving it that way so we could make breakfast in the morning. But what terrified me was what I saw on a tree right next to where we were having our fire. Impaled into the tree with an old rusty trowel was a piece of paper, and on the piece of paper was written in a very childish scrawl, "You both can't be married to Sharon Stone." I went back into the fort to see Eric getting out of his sleeping bag and told him we needed to get out of there. And we did. We put out the fire and then ran back to his house and slept on the back porch. In the morning, his father came out and said, "Hey, what happened to sleeping at the fort?" We told him what happened, and yeah, he saw the old garden trowel or whatever stabbed into the tree, and what was written on that note. I have no idea who was out there that night, or who decided to listen into our entire conversation, and then leave that threatening piece of paper that, quite frankly, looked like it had been written in blood, as if someone had pricked their finger and then wrote it on the piece of paper. I never went back to that fort, and neither did Eric. If I recall correctly, his parents forbade anybody from going back there. Anyway, that happened a long time ago, but I still replay it in my head like it was yesterday.